All right, folks, and we're back. Farmer Joe coming at you fresh from the farm. So today I want to talk about building an anti-fragile food system. So often we use the term resilient when we're talking about the food system. So the food system, just as a refresher, is all the components that come together, all the relationships and links between those components that come together to produce food and to distribute food. So what does it take to get a bite of food from the soil all the way into your mouth or my mouth or any consumer, right? Because at the heart of the food system, we've got the consumer. And so basically food, we'll start with the furthest distance. It might be coming from California or Mexico or Florida. And there's nothing wrong with getting food from California or Mexico or Turkey or wherever. We just need to bring some awareness and intentionality into how we're building our food system and realize that those longer supply chains are more fragile. And just making sure that we're building other things also that can serve as a backup that are less fragile. And so let's say they're coming from California, they're going through a distributor who's trucking them up to Canada, selling them to a wholesaler. The wholesaler is then distributing it to retailers who are then selling it to consumers. So that's like the long distance food chain involving, large scale monoculture, thousands of acres of lettuce in California being harvested, with workers, working in a very sort of what I call like an alienated workforce. So it's a way that like really takes the worker and puts him or her in a really like a cog in a machine, right? And so that's one side of things. On the other side of things, we've got local farms. And so local farms, either sell to a wholesaler, to the retailer, or directly to the consumer, or some local farms sell to us, Ottawa Farm Fresh, because we're both a producer and a retailer, right? So we have this interesting role. Urban farms, I think, have a very interesting role in that connection, right? Being that link, being that hub between all the local farms and the consumer. One convenient place where a consumer can get many of their food items top quality while minimizing the distance and the number of steps in the chain, thus making it less fragile, more anti-fragile. And I'll be talking about this in a second. So that's basically when I'm talking about the food system, I'm talking about all these links that come together to produce food and bring it all the way to the consumer. And this little diagram is even missing, it's missing quite a few steps, right? Because before it can go, whether that's in California or in a local farm, we're talking about seeds, we're talking about fertilizer, we're talking about pesticides, we're talking about labor, we're talking about fuel, infrastructure, capital, right? So all these resources, these farmers need to access sources of capital to build infrastructure, to build systems. There's a whole supply chain behind each farmer, right? Whether that's a conventional, I don't really like the term conventional, but whether that's like an old fact, like a chemical farmer, or whether that's a biological farmer, both of those are relying on a whole network of inputs. So for instance, here at Ottawa Farm Fresh, our seeds, they mostly come from High Mowing Organic Seed and Johnny Selected Seed. Big shout out if you're watching this video in Maine and Vermont. But we also do get some harder to find varieties locally from small seed producers. Then in terms of fertilizer, right? Where is that coming from? Well, we've got our Carlton mushroom compost. So that's mushroom, literally, like within a 10 kilometer radius, the mushroom producer is growing mushrooms, and all the media that they grow the mushrooms on afterwards is amazing compost. So we get that delivered. We also get like pelleted chicken manure and pelleted alfalfa meal, all sort of coming from the Ontario, Quebec regions, right? And then there's the different sorts of sprays, biological sprays that we're using, and fuel and blow up. I'm ranting now, but the point is you can see how complex this is, how many relationships really exist in this web. It's really a food web. It's essentially, it's putting human in their righteous place as an animal, as a creature in an ecosystem, right? This is what we call agroecology, is how do humans fit into the landscape, into the ecosystem. This is the human food chain. And, barring like the return of the dinosaurs, we're at the top of the food chain. So, here, anyway, I'm being silly now. So, fragile, anti-fragile, resistant, resilient. What are these terms? What do they mean and why do they matter? So one of the things I love doing in the winter is reading. I've been going through all these books by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Oh my God, I love it. He's just got that like cheekiness. I love how he writes, and I love the ideas and the way he approaches, the roles of randomness. He writes a lot. He wrote a book called Fooled by Randomness and Black Swan. So looking at the impact of these very low frequency but high impact events like an earthquake. It doesn't happen very often. You don't know when it's going to happen, and when it happens, it matters, right? Or a pandemic, or a zombie outbreak, or anything, right? So any of these low frequency events, apparently through research, what's come out is that humans are very bad at considering the role of randomness. It freaks us out, as you can understand, to think that there's these things that are way beyond our control, and so we just don't think about it. Our brain is great at creating mental models. Our brain is great at filling in the gaps when there's you got information. Our brain is just like, oh, I'm going to fill all that in. But that's not always the case. Anyway, and so what I've been realizing is, as we talk about building a resilient food system, we're actually committing a intellectual flaw there, where when we think of fragile is what we don't want. Well, fragile has its advantages sometimes, but fragile is fragile. It's easily breakable. If you were to send, let's say, a box of champagne glasses to Tajikistan, you would write fragile, handle with care. Because when something fragile is stressed, has some sort of thing happen to it, it usually degrades or breaks down. Fragile is associated with machines and inanimate objects. Generally speaking, a rock, if you hit it if it experiences a stress, it's going to crack. It's going to start to degrade. A washing machine, if it gets a stress, it ain't getting any better. It's getting broken, right? So certain elements, and I'll talk about this later, certain elements of the food system, especially the large-scale industrial system, produce a lot of efficiencies, but also expose us to a lot of fragility in terms of those black swan events, which are those low-frequency, high-impact, random events that happen in life, right? And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the opposite of fragile? And most of the time when you ask someone what is the opposite of fragile, they'll say either robust or resilient. And by the way, I'm not making any of this up. This is straight from the book. So it's a pretty thick book, so I'm taking some liberty and just summarizing. Often they'll say resistant or resilient as the opposite of fragile, but in reality, the opposite of fragile is something that not only would be not... the opposite of fragile, if a fragile thing is something that is harmed by a stress, well, an anti-fragile thing, the opposite of a fragile thing, would be something that would be improved by a stress. So resilience and robustness is neither improved nor degraded. And so it's like saying the opposite of positive is not neutral, right? The opposite of positive is negative. So similarly, we have fragile, we have anti-fragile, and somewhere in the middle, we got resilient. And these are not absolute terms, these are relative terms, right? This exists on a gradient with plenty of gray space and unknown and incomplete information and unknowable information. But I do find it to be an interesting framework when thinking about what is it that we want to create at a larger scale, because it's very easy to get caught up in oh my God, I'm growing these amazing, delicious veggies for these 500 families in Ottawa, and that's fantastic. And we also need to be aware that we are part of something larger. And so to bring together our collective intelligence and creativity into thinking, well, what is that larger thing that we're part of? And are we interacting with it and creating it in an intentional manner? Sometimes we need frameworks. And so this framework is very interesting. So I did a little brainstorm about sort of in terms of food production, what does that look like? So fragile, it's like large-scale monocropping. It's fragile because if you have a 2,000-acre field of lettuce and you get aphids in there, there's just so much aphid food and not enough other stuff to block those, to interrupt those cycles and provide a diversity of insects to eat the aphids. If you get an aphid problem in a 2,000-acre field, that's a problem. It's going to be serious. So you got to use chemicals, and eventually chemicals, they work till they don't work, and then you have a real problem. And also one of the natures of fragility is that the mistakes tend to be infrequent but very consequential. So, you're growing a 2,000-acre field of lettuce, you got everything under control with your chemicals, it's all great, it's all great, it's all great, boom, it's all great till it's not great. It's all great until your supply chain is disrupted and you can't get your pesticide. It's all great until the aphids develop a resistance to the pesticide. Any number of factors could come into play there. Fragile, long distance transport, also quite fragile, very convenient, very cost effective. One of the things that has led us towards such a reliance on the long distance industrial systems is that it creates an immense efficiency, which means the price can be lower. And that's obviously has its benefits. And I'm not saying we need to abolish long distance agriculture. I'm just saying that we need to be conscious about how we're building our own local systems so that in times of need, we have those resources available and ready to be scaled up. Obviously fragile reliance on purchased chemicals and inputs, and if that's tying you into a huge global supply chain, which just exposes you to all sorts of unforeseen events. Large corporate ownership and specifically the lack of skin in the game of many of the elements. As we're getting into these larger and larger organizations, the people making the decisions or implementing the decisions are of a more sort of corporate bureaucratic nature. And so the types of decision making and considerations and processes removes a little agency there. And that also can increase bring in some fragility there, right? Because I'll get to that later, the because of. And so likewise, alienated workforce, so people who do their job because they like the money and they like the stability of it, but they don't really love their job, right? And often a high debt load also. And debt can be an interesting source of energy, source of basically capital, and capital is a form of energy. And at the same time, it obviously, as maybe it locks us into certain patterns and reduces the potential for flexibility down the line. So that's obviously, to me it's obvious, but I won't be using that word anymore. No more you-knows or ums. I'm trying to really weed out these verbal tics from my vocabulary. So what's the next step? What's the next best thing as we're working our way along? Or what are some of the elements that we bring in here at Ottawa Farm Fresh and that we see with many of our partner farms in the local ecosystem? So we see biodiversity, right? So biodiversity means that there is a large, many different types of plants, animals, insects, microbiology, all in the same space. And so instead of 2,000 acres of lettuce, we've got, lettuce, beets, onion, all these little patches, a little bit like a patchwork, like a quilt, And so if there's a problem that erupts in one area, well, it might spread a little, but because the bed next to it is a different crop and a different crop and a different crop, well, you can't make it 10 beds over to where the other lettuce is. Because one of the interesting things about pests and disease is that most of them are specialists. Most of them are specific to a crop family. So a disease or a pest that affects a broccoli or anything in the broccoli family, so cabbage, kale, cauliflowers, turnips, radishes, arugula, all those will, generally speaking, not affect a tomato, which is in the Solanaceae family. So a brassica pest not going to affect the Solanaceae. So when you create this patchwork, you are creating a much more rich and diverse environment, which is less conducive to the explosion of pest populations. The other thing is when something does happen, let's say I have a bed of lettuce that's wiped out by aphids. Well, you know what? It's not a big deal because I grow 35 different types of crops planted every week from March until September. So the impact of losing one little bed is minimal. And that's one of the elements of, I can't find it on my list, but of the antifragile. In the antifragile, errors tend to be more frequent, but of a lower impact. And so that allows us to iterate and to improve. Think of it like a tinkerer, right? It allows us to tinker with the systems and slowly, incrementally improve them. And it's like that sort of like biological learning, right? Like our body, our body generally doesn't make huge improvements all at once. If we go to the gym, we're not going to walk out the next day looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his mid-20s, right? So, and going to the gym is exactly an expression of how the antifragile is so well expressed in biological and living systems, right? So when we go to the gym and we're working out, what we're doing is we're stressing our body. We're pushing it just just a little too far, you know? And our body, in response to that, improves. So that's a nice example. Like if you take a washing machine, if the washing machine goes to the gym, it's just going to break down. If a human goes to the gym, it's going to get better. So that's fragile washing machine, anti-fragile human. And obviously there's a limit. All these things, like I said, it's a spectrum. So yes, obviously a human, it's like if you get hit by a bus, it's not going to turn you into a more strong human. It's just going to splatter you. So don't do that. But the point being that biological systems, biodiversity, I sort of put in resilient, but it's touching on the anti-fragile. What I see in resilient systems is also owner-operated. That the farms, these people have skin in the game, have what he calls soul in the game. I don't know if you've ever met a local farmer, but they ain't doing it to get rich. They're doing it because it's in their heart. It's in their blood. It's just like they have to do it. It's a calling, basically. Peri-urban farms, so farms that are within like 100 miles, 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers of the city fall in the resilient. In the sense that they're able to the distances are less, and so the impact, the potential for disruption in a fragile long-distance system is less. The distances are less. We're depending on less factors to remain stable. Next item, short-distance transport, healthy soils, organic agriculture. So we're going to be focusing much more on feeding the soil rather than feeding the crop, because when we're directly feeding the crop with soluble chemicals, all those chemicals are just very ephemeral. You put them in, they go in the crop, they go off to market, boom. So if you have a disruption in the chain, or if you have a drought, all those soluble chemicals need to be soluble in something. They're soluble in water. And so in a drought, poof, no more food for the plant. Right? Fragile. Whereas in a more resilient or even anti-fragile system, we're talking about feeding the soil. So we're building the fundamental capacity of the soil to be part of the ecosystem, right? The soil is the foundation upon which the ecosystem is built. And one of the largest risk to the continued survival of large-scale human civilization is the degradation and loss of soils. So when you're feeding them just chemicals, there's no organic matter. Organic matter is the glue that holds it together. It's the fuel that feeds the microbiology. So feeding that soil organic matter is super important. And so that is going to create a system that when a change happens, it's a little more, it's more stable, right? It's not necessarily going to be improved by a change or by a stressor, but it will resist it. It's more resilient, resistant, robust, strong. These are terms for that middle category. And then finally, over on the other side, we have anti-fragile. So the anti-fragile is really a new concept. And it's interesting that, what he found, he looked through 28 different languages, and really few languages have really a sense word for this. And so it's a really interesting concept to me. So anti-fragile, like I said, really ties into the ability of an item or a system to improve or to evolve from a stressor. So think evolution, right? If a species is stressed by the presence of a new predator, so the individual may die, but the species as a whole is anti-fragile. It morphs, it evolves. Life itself is anti-fragile. Life will be here long after humans, Often people with an environmental consciousness, they're like, save the planet, but it's really what we're trying to say is save humans, because the planet doesn't give a fuck if we're around, right? The planet's going to be here, the ecosystem, the world is going to be here long beyond us. So when we say save the earth, save the planet doesn't need us to save it. If humans want to continue to be around for another 5,000 years, then we're going to have to start, living with our mother a little differently. But that's different. But it's not about saving the planet. It's about saving humans. So, back to this. Anti-fragile. So, living soils method, no-till. As we take what we're learning in organic and pushing it a level further, this is the innovation that's evolving a lot. I see in Quebec, a lot of innovation in small farms. There's 2 or 3 farms that are really cutting edge, and we're being inspired by them. We're doing some trials here. So living soils is this concept that you no longer till the soil, you don't worry about what you're fertilizing, and you really focus on building that thick surface organic matter layer, like in a forest. We're mimicking nature. So we're going to be using wood chips and cover crops and compost and experimentally on certain limited areas in our garden, eliminating tillage starting next year. So these systems are much more living. The earthworms, the fungi and hyphae are not all disturbed. We're really, really moving towards an ecosystemic understanding of what soil is. Antifragile agriculture is community-based. And I want to highlight these 3 points: community-based, right? Innovative human capital and visionary leadership, right? Those are elements. It's the ability to tap into the human creativity, both as an individual level, as a team level, and as a community level, which I believe is really crucial to building these anti-fragile farm systems. That, ideally, our farm is going to become so anti-fragile that I could be gone and you'll still continue to have the best veggies you've ever tasted right here at Ottawa Farm Fresh, because the staff, the community, the staff, the team will all be this like dynamic ecosystem essentially, right? Agroecosystemic approach. I love that word, agroecosystem. Anti-fragile is really having these farms close to the city, right? It's these farms and that's one of the reasons I think the Greenbelt is amazing. If you're not from here and you're part of your municipal council or whatever in some other town, please make a Greenbelt. Every city needs a Greenbelt. Here we have 12,000 acres of farmland protected around Ottawa, and it's going to create, I think, in the next 20 to 50 years, this amazing situation where you have an urban core, you have a strip of agricultural land, and you have more urban centers on the other side. And it's going to create this texture and this ability for the local cities to continue feeding themselves. So please, if you're not in Ottawa, make yourself a Greenbelt. If you're in Ottawa, protect the Greenbelt now and forever. Boom. Opportunistic use of local resources. That's for us. I love this concept that your waste is my resource. And I saw this guy online. His name is escaping me, but one of his videos was so. I love how he said it. He said, if the earth is our mother and we drink from her teat, well, the earth requires poop to make milk, right? That cycle eventually is going to need to get closed in human, civilizational planning. Is how to make sure that recycling of nutrients is happening from what's coming out of us back into the soil and connecting that. But that's a conversation beyond that for the scope of today. And workforce empowerment and, maybe equity and ability of equity shares like in the business, the ability of people to really become part of the business and have a sense of both psychological but also physical ownership. So that is today's episode on the Antifragile system. Check this out, Nassim Taleb, Antifragiles, Things That Gain from Disorder. And Farmer Joe, Farm and Fresh for you, and I'll catch you all on the flip side.